Without a hint of doubt in my mind, my three favorite gaming genres are racing games, belt-scrolling beat-em-up, and real-time strategy. If you had to associate for each genre these terms, chess, race, and address, I guess you would proceed like this. Well, I will do this. What matters in a racing game is how precise you are at controlling your car, and you devote all your attention to that purpose. You don't feel as much a sense of rush as in a RTS, because the acceleration of your car is finite. All you can do is make sure you're preserving as much of its speed during corners by dosing your gas pedal, aiming your direction just right, timing precisely everything. It's like a music partition you repeat so that this car follows the absolute best trajectory. From the very first second of the game, RTS are a straight race to the best eco. It's not just what's happening on screen, it's how fast you must play, with metrics such as APM, action per minute, factoring heavily into your chances to win, unlike any kind of racing games. On the other side, and unlike chess, units mostly respond to each other in a rock-paper-scissors kind of way. Your rifleman's not going to deal much damage to that tank, will feel helpless against that plane, etc. In chess, your knight isn't inherently hard-countered by the bishop and hard-countering the tower. It just needs to be spaced properly. You have exactly that in belt-scrolling beat-em-up. Well, at least you used to. That enemy isn't countering you as long as you're not jumping on it, and that one has just so much more reach than you must approach it from the side if you want to hit it, like in chess. Even more so, they're all about controlling the screen. Nowadays, if you show people this picture and ask them what kind of game they hope it will devolve into, it will probably be something like this. If you ask me what I want, well, I want this. The screen is your chessboard. Just like in chess, you must constantly reassess your position as to get the upper hand on the enemies. You've got all these different enemy types that all control their own little niche, like a chess piece, and you have to draw them in your head so as to understand where you yourself need to be. You can't just go right to the enemy that is completely outranging you, be it with its kicks or projectiles. Just like you cannot remain comboing that enemy there if someone else, who is not stun-locked, can charge at you from beyond your reach. Their area of influence is all that matters, and since you're only controlling one piece on the board, you have to either divide and conquer, or group them all together so they are all subjected to your own area of influence, and you can dispose of all of them at the same time. In a lot of old-school beat-em-up, you usually cannot dodge your way out. You must calculate and anticipate the consequences of your actions, confronting them against the most likely moves of the AI. If you let them move as they please, you're going to be checkmate. And when I say checkmate, I mean that your character will still be there, still have not suffered any blow, you'll still be in control of it, but you're doomed to take it, or sacrificed some health, at least, because you have let the other chess pieces position themselves in such a way that they cover all of your options. So you must be proactive, and that is called space control. In chess, so much importance is based on controlling the center, d4, e4, g5 and e5 mainly, because of how much squares coverage it gives, how strongly it helps you restrict your opponent's piece movement, and how it facilitates attack on both kingside and queenside. Many openings aim to control or contest the center. Getting cornered, be it in a chessboard or a belt scroller, is really a bad outcome. Cornering in both is a very positive one. Because of that, belt scrollers have a very snowballing gameplay. And if you think I'm done with the parallels, you think wrong. Hitting on a piece, be it in a beat-em-up or in chess, opens you up. It can create threats you have to assess preemptively, but it can also create opportunities by removing repositioning threats. We can also talk about resource management. In chess, you do material management, sacrificing pieces to gain the upper hand. In beat 'em up, you trade health. Since Final Fight, a lot of them lets you trade some health for what we call a death blow, or desperate attack, a special form of attack that will consume part of your health to clear the immediate vicinities and let you take a better position. So even if belt-scrolling beat-em up is frantic real-time action, 1. It's actually much less frantic than a RTS, and you're unlikely to put even half of the action per minute you'd be doing in both. 2. How you control the screen and read your opponent's moves are much more going to impact the outcome than how good you are at pressing inputs in sequences, a skill that is usually as low as mashing the send button 4 or 5 times in a row. But you're probably under the impression I'm overthinking it, and I cannot blame you, because what I'm talking here is past and done. There are few further things to chess than modern beat-em up, for the most case. All 2D and 3D beat-em up now are about reactive gameplay. Passively waiting for your enemies to commit, avoid, parry their damned attacks and punish them. You're like the cute little bride invited on the dance floor, so focus on following the lead of your dancing partner, execute what he's asking you from small hand gestures, and have pleasure by knowing you look so sexy doing that. And looking sexy is what they focus on badly. Hence why what you picture in your head is those badass juggle combos you will repeat for 2 hours straight until there's not a single neuron left active in your brain. While it's not bad per se, after all, one of the best things with video games is how they can offer so many different experiences. The kind of beat 'em up where you have to act before you're doomed, they're no longer there. And they're no longer there for both historical and philosophical reasons. Let's cover this, shall we? Historic first. The golden era of 2D beat-em up is usually considered to be between 1989 to 1994, although they were making the most money between 1989 and 1993. Many people will tell you they've been superseded by fighting games, but that's not exactly true, as 1993 was still a phenomenal year for beat-em up, if not the best year of all time, and that was a big year for FTGs as well. We can also see that they disappear first in the arcade, but remain strong on 16-bit consoles, including the Neo Geo AES, which was not the case on 5th generation's consoles. So you can start to guess what put an end to beat 'em up. Another consideration to have is that both SNK and Capcom were, with Sega, the last ones to keep making them. Since they were the pillars of fighting games, and if fighting games were truly replacing beat 'em up, they should have been the first to shift development budgets from beat 'em up to fighting games. Meanwhile, studios like Konami, who hit big on the beat 'em up market, didn't stop to replace them with FTGs, they shifted to other genres. And also, I think they are not competing directly. One is PvP, the other PvE. The multiplayer mode of Half-Life isn't competing with its campaign. Actually, the end of real events for beat 'em up coincide more with the democratization of 3D. 3D was most of the market in the arcade in 1994, so here the dates really coincide. On home console, you had to wait the 5th generation for this kind of mind-blowing 3D revolution, and that's why the disappearance was a bit more delayed there, and why you still had beat 'em up on the Neo Geo up to 2000, and on the Game Boy Advance after that. When 3D appeared, it's important to recall that everyone wanted 3D games and nothing else. It was that much of a revolution. Devs had to make their games in 3D. For many genres, it was quite easy to transpose the 2D games in 3D. FTGs and racing games are particularly good examples. For beat 'em up, it wasn't quite the same. It was pretty heavy on resources, so you had to wait 1996 for a first 3D release with Dynamic Deca from Sega, which is very late compared to the first full 3D games like Virtua Racing in 1992, and it still felt quite clunky and slower than typical 2D beat 'em up. But there was something else, something more, Not something we can really discuss with Dynamic Deca, which still adopted the best scrolling view, but starting with the first real 3D beat-em up that was the famous Fighting Force. Loved by some, hated by others, Fighting Force felt like a beat-em up aesthetically, but it was a very simple banded button masher with simple strats that will carry you through the end on your very first playthrough without any difficulty. And many medias at the time started to write that beat-em up were no longer a real event, just an old arcade basic experience only good for stress relief. We now had moved past it. The genre had to evolve, it had to drastically change. Yet racing games didn't have to. Shmups didn't have to. Fighting games didn't have to. Why beat-em up couldn't work in 3D? Were they really just dumb games we tolerated because of a lack of something better? For me, there are two big reasons. I call the first one, enemies are always facing you. In 2D, they face in your general direction, but they face their lane. In 3D beat-em up, you no longer get the protection from being on a different lane. Because there's no such thing, or rather, your character is a fucking city of Rome and all lanes lead to you. This means you no longer outmaneuver your opponents. You come straight at them, period. This will lead to giving the player new instant dodge moves or other defensive maneuvers, and later on to the predominance of Simon Says gameplay in 3D beat-em up, but also hack and slash, action RPG, etc. I call the second one, you are always surrounded. In true 3D games, there are no juxtaposition of enemies, because it looks silly. So they are physically well separated. You no longer group them to suck them into your jabs. Throwing one of them is no longer going to have any meaningful effect outside dealing some damage and isolating just this one enemy from the rest. This led to the disappearance of throws and crowd control now performed by attacks that cover a huge arc instead, exaggerated to the extremes in Muso-style games like Dynasty Warriors. That's why 3D beat-em up will favor big melee weapons, instead of all the hand-to-hand combat we had in 2D. And when they go for hand-to-hand, it's often with the addition of oversized gauntlets. This is also because it's harder to judge distance effectively with all the different angles the camera can adopt. And in that regard, moving chain systems, I mean by that your character moving forward as it's performing a hit string, which was previously uncommon in 2D, will also be enforced. Or even your character fully moving in range on its own so you don't miss, sucked onto your opponent. So where 2D beat-em up are greatly emphasizing good spacing, 3D don't. Instead, attacks have long activation frames. We lose the good old fundamentals for more reactive, rhythmic mechanics. There's another side effect brought by 3D, the mobility imperative. Side-scrolling beat-em up limits the player field of view drastically, so having enemies waiting 20 meters ahead doesn't look at all stupid. You just don't see them. In 3D, you do, and progressing through the environment is more attractive to the point that a lot of players enjoy exploring them in depth. In 2D, how fast the playable characters can move around the screen is very much a question of how you want your combats to feel. You can make the pieces slow or with a pretty stiff, vulnerable run, and at the same time have your enemies move faster or at least as fast, so that the players have to act and commit instead of just running circles around the enemies. You can also use it as a variable to make your roster of playable characters feel like whole new games on their own. In 3D, you don't want the players to lose time moving around the environment, because it will make your game badly paced and boring, and you cannot steal their movement options when the combat starts, because this will feel artificial in a bad way. On top of that, the arenas where you fight your enemies are no longer confined to a single screen. All of these mean that now you can avoid your enemies, flee from them, turn around them, instead of having to fight for your ground. You could, of course, make enemies that much faster, like in Ninja Gaiden, so they can still catch up with you, but that also makes your game faster as a whole, which means faster, less calculated decisions. Switching a few things can change so much. Think about the transition from 2D to 3D in beat-em up, like the transition from 2D horizontal or vertical shmups to rail shooters. What is a rail shooter if not a shoot-em up where the camera is put behind your ship? The gameplay should feel the same. And yet, so much change. Now enemies and bullets will occupy your space for a fraction of a second. You no longer compete for the control of it. On the contrary, you're pretty free to move around, and those games' main threat comes from having to expose yourself in order to aim. For beat 'em up, just the simple things I've mentioned meant the world. You lose the restricted board, you lose the restricted lanes, you lose the restricted moves, you lose the restricted squares. And since we were in a 3D era where you had to develop games in 3D to sales, beat 'em up as we knew them mostly disappeared for a time. It's not because they were branded stress relief no longer welcomed. If you think we had to wait for 3D action games to understand the depth of dodging and parrying, you're deluding yourself. Old people developing or playing old games were on cavemen with tiny brains. Punch-Out is from 1984 and already offered, both very elegantly and very successfully, patterns with detailed startup frames and different timing-based defensive options in response to different types of attacks. Many 2D old-school side-scrolling beat-em-up have proposed block, parries and the likes, such as the Ninja Warriors, Super Double Dragon, Knights of the Round, Golden Axe 3, Shadow of the Misara, but it is 3D that made these elements not better, but necessary. In my opinion, the deepest beat-em-up ever made have been almost entirely released between 1989 and 1995. But now you've got a decade or more of 3D action games with all their mobility. You've got generations fed on mad combos videos on YouTube and Zik just framing all parries through boss jacks. And their expectations of that kind of games is just that. Being able to perform long sequences of inputs they have previously memorized to look sex while killing stuff, learning the exact moment they need to press a button to avoid an attack. Their perception of death is being good at invisible cuties and self-expressing themselves with joggles. You've got a new generation of devs who see the opportunity to revisit old-school bell-scrolling beat-em-up while adding all this stuff. Not understanding they're losing the chess-like feel by just giving the players these powerful tools to reset any situation. By just letting them move around enemies with ease. By just giving more startup frames to enemies' attacks so that they can dodge them effectively. You just end up with any action game being a Simon Says experience, and the complete idea of controlling the screen, a concept lost in time. You spend half of your time dodging, waiting for your specific window to act, and half of your time executing for the 1000th time your bread and butter combo. What future is there for proactive space controlling gameplay in our Dark Souls era? From a mainstream perspective, I'm afraid, none. The thing that gets most people with this genre is that they go into it expecting to dodge telegraphed attacks on reaction like any single action game, but then enemies start punching you with fighting game speed unreactable jabs, and you're like, what the fuck is this ship quarter munching bullshit? So a game like Shredder's Revenge, with big tails on enemy attacks, super armor to let them perform those attacks, despite the absurd amount of startup frames, and a bad dodge punish dynamic will instantly be understood and saluted by the press. And a game like Final Vendetta will be murdered, considered absurdly difficult and archaic, despite being one of the easiest old-style beat-em-up on the market, something you will finish in a couple of hours at most in art if you're just slightly familiar with screen control and how to deal with the enemy chess pieces. That's where things get darker.
Because so many people don't understand the basics of belt scroller. So many absurdly easy recent releases have been somewhat criticized for their difficulty. And I'm not joking, I'll give you a very good example. Wolverblade on the Switch, one of the easiest belt-scrolling beat-em-up I've ever played, has been constantly compared to Dark Souls by game journalists. I can understand that for people who have no clue what they should do, like not just aligning themselves to the closest enemy and slashing at them without any consideration to what spaces the other enemies are currently controlling, beginners' entry levels into the genre can feel brutal. But then, the problem is that they are the ones who judge these games. Devs are already far too shy when it comes to ramping the difficulty up, to give a difficulty choice that will be closer to what we were used to. And they are criticized for making it too hard. And even more importantly, journalists are inconsistent in judging what games feel or feel not a wake-up call to the genre. Wolverblade is easy and shallow enough that, ironically, they get it's not a mindless button basher. But ramp up the difficulty a bit more and now they become blinded to why they are being abused. Our reading grade can be vastly different between one another, and there are few genres where this is truer than beat 'em up. So I want to make that French thing and start a food analogy here. Video games in general, and beat 'em up in particular, are like chocolate or coffee. A game like River City Girls 2, you can see it as a pumpkin spice latte or some other fancy drink you can have at Starbucks. It's rich, tasty, and even if you don't like coffee that much, there's good chance you'll like this one. Something like Final Fight now is black coffee, no sugar, no milk, no crème fouettée. There's no way you're going to enjoy it first try. It will feel more bitter tasting than everything you're used to. Now, imagine you're really into coffee. Every day you go to your favorite coffee shop to enjoy one good cup of coffee, and now let's say you order a pumpkin spice latte every day. A month later, will you still enjoy it as much? Now some people do. Some people will play hundreds of beat 'em up and still prefer freedom over everything else. We all have different tastes. But in general, from what I've seen at least, they'll move on to more focused experience. A very good black coffee, once a day, a month later, you might very well enjoy it even more. That's what we call acquired taste. By essence, your brain is addicted to fat, which you could see as more content, moves, combos, RPG mechanics, and sugar, which you could see as instant dodge, instant parries, moves that give an instant reward. The core content behind becomes diluted. To appreciate this core without the rest will require you to educate your taste. In River City Girls 2, you've got all those playable characters to try, all these moves to unlock, you're always discovering, experimenting. But after a few daily sessions, you know what works, you see no counterplay on your tactics, you just do different things for the sake of doing different things. It's no longer a game, it's a sandbox, a toy. I'm tired of this idea that depth is just the amount of moves or the length of the combos. With new releases especially, you see so many people tell things like, "You don't think this game is deep? Look at that combo video." Or the opposite. "This game is so basic you can't even dodge." On previews, you hear people saying, "Well, so far it looks cool, but we'll have to play it more to see if it's deep or the combo possibilities." This is the current state of the beat 'em up genre. And the future state just looks like even more options, even more things to unlock, stats to improve. So while you grind for the shiny stuff, or even buy it in real life, without thinking of why you want it in the first place, while you progress for the sole sake of discovering the rest of the game as if it was a movie, you're losing everything that made these games actually a lot smarter than people give them credit for. I guess we just checkmate the genre.